Right. So, I am making this video to sort of share, for lack of a better term, ideas for new units or customizations to be added to the current specializations. Hopefully, this is going to be a part of a couple of video series that I make where I go over new units that can be added to the current specializations or new customization options for existing units in the first video, this one. And then in the next 2 or maybe 3 videos, I go over ideas I have for new specializations for the US or Russia. I could probably do videos for new nations like Germany, Britain, China, Israel, um, South Korea, Japan, France, things like that. But I don't. I don't. I just want to focus on the nations currently in the game. Although I did encounter on, now that I think about it, I did encounter on the Steam forums, someone made a pretty well detailed post about a 4 specialization, about Germany with 4 specializations, which I thought was pretty good. Anyway, I digress. So now, if I'm gonna be honest, for most of these videos, most of the stuff that I'm going to talk about is going to be for the United States. And the reason why is just because the United States is the military that I am more familiar with than Russia. So I don't, for lack of a better term, I'm not familiar with enough Russian stuff to be able to speculate too much for Russia's sake. Although I do have an idea for a specialization that Russia might be able to that might be able to be added for Russia. So, firstly, also I'm not going to be talking about the USMC specialization too much for the US because that folds into one of the other videos that I'm going to be doing. Firstly, well, I will say this. I'm not going to be talking about it too much, but there are a couple of things well, there's one thing I'd like to mention. And that's the possibility of the, shoot, what's it called? Either the LAVD or the LAVAD E6 or the LAV25 E6. I can't remember which. I'll probably edit it. Make a note of it in the video. Basically, the plan was to take a 4-barrel 30mm rotary cannon, the GAU 13. I think it's the GAU 13, which is basically a 4-barrel version of the 7-barrel GAU 8, and mount it on the LAV-AD, or on an LAV chassis, much like the LAV-AD. You could add that as a customization option for the LAV-AD, and what it would do is it would give the LAV-AD radar, a bigger gun, at the expense of missiles. Although, I suppose you could add a Stinger pod or two. I'll probably put up a picture of one, or of it, at some point here. And the whole idea behind this is that you're giving the Marines a radar-based SHORAD system so they can shoot down cruise missiles. And this is one of the reasons why was and honestly still am a bit iffy about giving them the PAC-2 Patriot. Because if you want to give the Marines something with a radar-based air defense system, you can give them that, and it's not the PAC-2 Patriot. Now, you might be thinking, well, didn't the Marines recently acquire an Iron Dome battery too? They did, and I will get into that in the next video I make talking about the new upcoming specialization. It's going to involve the Marines. Anyway, I digress. Like I said, I don't want to get into too much here. So, a couple things I do want to suggest, particularly for armored, have to do with the AMPV. Now, there's a couple of variants of the AMPV out there. I mean, the mortar carrier is in the game. It's an AMPV with a mortar. Potentially, and I'm not sure exactly how this would work with the, well, no, it shouldn't. Theoretically, it shouldn't interfere with the ammunition customization, but there was an AMPV variant with a single-barreled automatic or quasi-automatic mortar. It's basically it's known as the Nemo, and it's a sort of a lighter version of the Amos. So that might be an interesting upgrade to give it range roughly equivalent to something like the Russian 2S31, I think it's called. Where is it? Yes, the 2S31 Vena. Specifically, I mean something like a counterpart to the extended range upgrade that the Vena gets. Something to extend the range of the mortar for the AMPV mortar carrier. Another option for the AMPV is one thing that BAE has toyed with is basically an AMPV, but with the Striker M Shorad's RWS. So basically, imagine an AMPV, but with the 30mm autocannon and the pair of Stinger pods from the Striker M Shorad. That could be added in the game as a second air defense system alongside the linebacker. And assuming we're talking about the same upgrades that both the AMPV and the Striker gets, excuse me, you're probably looking at something to the effect of maybe 225 to 250 points, fully kitted out with armor, APS, the 30mm, and the pair of Stinger pods. And honestly, if you're going to do that, I kind of understand why the Hellfires wouldn't be an option, because you would already have the Hellfires on the M6. And it's worth noting that in the promotional images, it shows the system with the two Stinger pods, rather than with any Hellfires, which is notable. That and the Army doesn't actually use the Hellfires on the M Shorad anymore, because basically using them on the ground resulted in more wear on the missile than what was acceptable. Which, if you think about the placement on the Striker M Shorad, and then you look at the placement on the M6 M Shorad with the Hellfires, on the M6 it had to have been worse. Anyway, basically by mounting the system, say, on the AMPV, you're making something akin to a Striker M Shorad, which I think could be kind of interesting. As now, again, not to replace the M6, just as a supplement, something to work alongside it. Again, potentially without the Hellfires, or some of the other options like the 50 cal and the 4 Stingers. So the base price might be, what's the base price of the M Shorad just with the, it's 150. So yeah, you might be looking at something around 150 to 160 base before you've put all the armor on it. Because if you put armor and you put APS on it, what you're effectively looking at is something that has the same APS charges, but is more heavily armored, with about the same durability. And obviously it would have radar. Another thing I wanted to get at with the Armor Brigade specialization, another new addition, which I think would be interesting, would be something called the GCV. The GCV, or Ground Combat Vehicle, was a program developed by the Army it started in 2009, canceled in 2014 as a new IFV to replace the Bradley. It was a follow-on from the Manned Ground Vehicle program as part of the Future Combat Systems program, which honestly those could be that could probably be a specialization in its own right. Anyway, I digress. The Manned Ground Vehicle, the whole idea was like 8 different types of vehicle that all fit on the same chassis. You had a tank analog, not exactly a tank. It was only supposed to weigh like 20 to 30 tons and have no armor. relying on APS. I mean, they all would have relied on APS and been very light to be easily transportable. Again, I digress. The GCV, the idea behind it was that it was an IFE, a very heavy IFE. There was two contractors. There was General Dynamics and then there was BAE Systems. The lightest estimate for the General Dynamics version was 60 tons. And that goes up to 70. The lightest estimate for the BAE version was 70 tons, and that goes up to 84. For reference, the M1A2 Set V3, one of the heaviest tanks in the world, weighs 72.5 tons. And the Army has looked at the Set V3 and is basically going, guys, this is starting to get ridiculous. The tank is heavy. I mean, heck, one of the major design goals for the M1E3 that's supposed to enter testing, for lack of a better term, in the early 2030s is to make the tank lighter because it is heavy. I mean, heck, even at 60 tons, that's basically what the Abrams weighed when it entered service in the 1980s. So the vehicle is heavy. The vehicle is basically going to be about as heavy as a tank. It's also going to be very, very heavily armed. Not armed, armored. It would have the ability to hold 9 guys. Although there was, early in the program, the Army wanted it to carry 12, the same as the AMPV, which was developed later. But I think sticking with 9 would be good so that it doesn't completely eclipse the AMPV. And 9 is still enough to give you interoperability with the Striker Cav, the Airborne, and SOCOM specializations. The vehicle was I already said it was supposed to be very heavily armored against. Now, part of that was protection against mines and IEDs. Other parts of that were protection against things like ATGMs. So I'm guessing, protection-wise, the vehicle might have armor roughly akin to the M10 Booker. So 300 millimeter kinetic protection from the front, 800 millimeter heat protection from the front. And what is it, like 250 from the side and 120 from the side? Heat and kinetic respectively. No, it's 100 from the side, kinetic. But that would be base. It was, if memory serves, it was supposed to have a 30 millimeter autocannon as a armament. The Bushmaster 2. The Army, to my knowledge, never decided on an ATGM, but I assume it probably would have had something like maybe TOW 2B specifically. That, or maybe Javelin. But the information I have doesn't say one way or the other. I'm going to assume TOW. Although, the choice between TOW and Hellfire, or not Hellfire, Javelin would be interesting, since Javelin can be fired on the move, but TOW can't. Would it be worth taking the reduction in damage and range as a trade-off for the ability to fire the missile on the move? But the Bushmaster 2 is most likely going to be the autocannon. Mobility, I think, was going to be roughly on par, or was supposed to be roughly on par with the Abrams. I can't find any information about that, but it wasn't supposed to be any worse than the Bradley. So I think it's a fair bet to say that it would have been on par with the Abrams. So look at the speed and the on-road and off-road speed of an Abrams, and you'll basically get the idea. I think what comes into it, where it would make it more interesting, would be upgrades. Now, this is just purely my speculation, but a base cost might be, say, $175 for the base vehicle to have armor protection roughly the same as a Booker and a 30mm autocannon and the ability to carry 9 guys. And maybe what's the and the base durability of a T-15 is 18 hit points. And yes, if you haven't figured this out yet, and if I haven't already mentioned it because my memory is terrible, this is supposed to be an American version of the T-15. Which is kind of interesting, because if they moved the T-15 into the vehicle tab and hard limited its availability to 2, I don't see why they wouldn't do the same thing here. So, whereas most AFVs have a hit point value of about 14 to 16 without extra armor. Then again, the T14 also has a base hit point value of 18 as well. Base price would maybe be 175 for a Bushmaster 2, maybe a Bradley style tow launcher, a coax, 240, 9 guys on M10 Booker style protection with about 18 health. Or maybe 16 health. No, let's go with 16 health. And the way I see it is you'd have 3 customization options. The first would be to exchange the 30mm out for a 50mm, like what the Booker could carry. The next would be an extra armor package to bring its to bring its armor up to maybe the same level as a SEP. So we're talking about front armor being 750 against kinetic and 1300 against heat, which is slightly less kinetic than a T15, but the same heat protection. But the idea is that the vehicle is obviously supposed to be very heavily armed. It doesn't necessarily need to have the exact same protection as the T15, but it's supposed to be very heavily armed from the front, much like the T15 is. I mean, heck, even a basic A2 would be bad. Although, if you're talking about a Booker, like if the Booker's armor protection is supposed to be the base, you might want to raise the front kinetic protection from 300 to about maybe 500, 600, something like that. I just go with 500. And then you have armor, or yeah. So yeah, I already mentioned the add-on armor, which would raise the hit points to 18, raise the protection roughly to SEP V2 or SEP. Actually, I think the SEP and the SEP V2 have the same armor protection. Yes, raise the armor protection to about SEP levels. One other thing I should probably mention: this thing would have an active protection system built in from the get-go, the same way the T14 and T15 do. Now that I lay all these out, 175 might be a little bit cheap. Maybe, then again, 200 might be a little bit expensive. I mean, this is speculation anyway. And then the third upgrade would be to the toes. And I'm gonna mention this as well later on. But you have there was a toe variant, called the Toe RF, if memory serves. And what it was basically a version of the Toe missile, but instead of being guided with a wire like the Toe missile normally is, it uses a radio frequency guidance, which is what the RF is for. The thing is, to my knowledge, it was never adopted for some reason. Hughes developed a tow missile with a wireless data link in 1989, referred to as the Tow 2N. Raytheon continued to develop improvements. Its FOTT, F-O-T-T, follow-on to tow program canceled in 98. The Tow FF, Tow Fire and Forget, was cut short in 2002. Although the missile was not produced since 2000, no U.S. Army designation. Wireless versions of the Tow 2A, the Tow 2B, and the Tow 2B Arrow have been developed using a stealthy one-way radio link identified with the suffix RF. These missiles require no special alteration to the launcher, since the RF transmitter is encased along with the missile and uses the standard umbilical data connector. So that's interesting, I think. And what this could do is it would basically extend the range of the tow missile out to 1,800 meters to match the Cornet M. And the idea behind this, the idea behind this is exactly what I just said. It extends the range to match that of the Cornet M out to 1,800 meters. It wouldn't do anything fancy with the tow, like give it fire and forget capability, but extend the range. So you might have a relatively cheap upgrade maybe, I don't know, 10 points. However, if you can fire a TOW on the move, that might be another option. Because one of the big issues, at least from my understanding, with firing a TOW missile on the move is that there's a physical wire connection between the launching vehicle and the missile. And if this wire connection gets interrupted by anything, like, say, a tree gets in the way as you're driving along and snags on the wires and severs the wires, you can no longer guide the missile. But if you have a radio frequency connection, you don't have to worry about this problem. Now, it's worth noting that radio frequency connections are used in pretty much all the Russian ATGMs. Melts, Faggot, Conkers, Kornet, I think Atatka as well. They all use the same radio frequency guidance. TOW, the advantage between radio frequency guidance is that it's simpler, at least in ways, than a wire-guided system. But a wire-guided system is very, very, well, it's effectively impossible to jam. There's a reason why you've seen over the last year both Russia and Ukraine lean heavily into wire-guided small drones. So the basic idea is a TOW with an extended range, possibly with the ability to fire TOW on the move. It would still be semi-active guidance, but possibly with the ability to fire TOW on the move. Although I don't see that anywhere, so let's just stick with the extended range. And those would be the three the three upgrades for the GCV: extra armor, a 50mm autocannon, and a slightly extended range TOW. And the idea I originally had was that the base price would be about $175, and the complete price would be about $250 once you've tacked everything on. That, I think, could be interesting. Although if you up the base price to $200 and then $250 once you tack everything on, well, I mean, like, $200 base, and then $10 for the extended range TOW, $15 for the 50mm autocannon, and then $25 for the extra armor. On the subject of the regular Bradleys, however, I'm kind of surprised. Not super surprised, but I am a little surprised, if I'm going to be honest. You don't have the option to mount the 30mm Bushmaster 2 in the Bradley. Because if memory serves, the original plan for the 30mm Bushmaster 2 was that it would be used to upgun the Bradley. But you don't see that in game. That, plus the option of mounting the extended range TOW for maybe 10 points each, would be interesting for the Bradleys, I think. Granted, you'd be hiking the price. You might be able to mount. Well, mainly I was thinking about this in the context of the A3 Bradleys, the A3, the A3 ESV, the A3 CFE, things like that. But you might be able to mount them in all Bradleys, because there was a radio frequency version of the TOW 2A as well, which is what all the A2 Bradleys are armed with. So, what's the fully kitted out price of an A2 Bradley? What's that, like 90? No, it's only 75. So maybe 85 for the extra range TOW 2A, or 95 if you want to give it the Bushmaster 2 as well, which I think would be interesting. It'd probably make the earlier Bradleys more used than the later Bradleys. Honestly, well, I say the earlier Bradleys. It would make people use, or at least look at the A2 Bradleys more than the A3 Bradleys. The thing with the A3 Bradleys is that you just get better armor in the form of Busk 3, and you get an active protection system, and you get a better engine. Although, to be fair, 75 points for what you get with an upgraded A2 Bradley isn't bad. It's not spectacular, but it isn't bad. And presumably the 30mm autocannon will also filter to something like the B-Fist, which, if memory serves, would be 140 fully upgraded. Again, if you're talking about an extra 10 points for the 40. Or not the 40, the extra 10 points for the 30, which might be a little bit optimistic, seeing as the price for the Bushmaster in general seems to be about 20 points. I mean, it's 20 points in the AMPV. It's 20 points on the ICV Striker. And I want to say it's 20 points on the ACV. Yes, it is 20 points on the ACV. on the Striker RV, the Bushmaster 2 is 25 points, but that's still 20 points more than the M2 or the Mark 19 options. Saying it's 10 points might be a little bit optimistic. Then again, with all of those platforms, you're upgrading from like a basic 50 cal or Mark 19 to the Bushmaster 2. With the Bradleys, you're upgrading from the 25 millimeter Bushmaster to the Bushmaster 2, which is 30 millimeter. So you probably don't have to go that far. It's not that big of a jump in capability, is the point I'm trying to get at. On the subject of the TOW missiles, which I briefly touched on with the TOW RF, you could potentially apply that to a lot of places. I mean, heck, if you really want to get enterprising, then you could mount it on, or then you could mount the upgrade option on everything from the Bradleys to infantry, the infantry systems to heck, even the Super Cobra. I don't entirely see a reason why, but you could do it on the Super Cobra if you wanted to. However, if I'm going to be entirely honest, it might mess with some of the upgrade options. Like with the airborne infantry, the TOW 2A team. Do you just add another option for like, because you've got the TOW 2A, which is base, you got the TOW 2B, which is 20 points. So do you add like TOW 2A and then TOW 2A RF for 10 points? TOW 2B and then TOW 2B RF for like 30 points? What do you do? I mean, I don't theoretically see why you couldn't do that with the games without trying to jump into the code and mess with the upgrades. I don't see why you couldn't do that. The alternative would be to make a new customization option between just regular and like wire guided and RF. I don't know. I mean, it'd be interesting, but I don't know. For example, like with the Humvee, do you want to do the same thing there? I don't see how that would be an issue with the game's current customization system, as I said, but I'm not entirely sure how to get it to work. Now, as an aside, because I was just talking about the Armor Brigade specialization, one thing I don't really want to suggest would be things like the M1A3, which is what the M1E3 is going to be type classified as. At least that's what we think the M1E3 is going to be type classified as. Or the M30, which is what the XM30 is should be type classified as. And the reason why I say that is because those aren't built yet. The E3, if there has been a prototype of the E3 built and tested, I don't know. The XM30, I think Rheinmetall, or at least Rheinmetall's US division, has modified a version of the KF-41 Lynx for it, but I'm not sure. As for the GDLS entry, which actually, from my understanding, isn't supposed to be that much different than the Booker with the 50mm autocannon. In fact, when I remember at one point after getting the game, I took the Booker and I equipped it with the 50mm to see if it gave it the ability to carry 6 troops. It did not, unfortunately. The problem with those vehicles is that you don't have the developers seem hesitant to add anything to the game that has not at least reached the physically built functional prototype stage. So we don't have anything like I'm trying to think of something off the top of my head. We don't have anything like the SU-75 Checkmate in the game because, I mean, sure, you saw a mock-up at an Arms Depot, but that thing doesn't work. Well, Arms Fair, not Arms Depot. At the same time, we don't have, or well, we do have things like the the MH60X Silent Hawk. I don't think anyone's ever seen it, and at least to my knowledge, there's been no pictures of it released. But something flew the guys into the Bin Laden raid, and there was a funky looking tail structure that was left from the blown up helicopter that did not look normal. So it clearly exists, just if we haven't seen it. But they don't, or they seem very hesitant to add things that have not at least gotten off the drawing board. So things like the M1 E3 or the XM30, I don't expect to see those added to the games anytime soon. Maybe as like a sort of future weapons style specialization with things like the E3, the XM30, maybe the F47, or other things like that, at least for the US. I can kind of see that. If you gave me a day or two, I could probably think of enough units for the Russians. The Russians have a lot of built, functional, at least for parade work, prototypes. The T14, T15, the B10, the K16, things like that. So those are in the game. But things like the stealthy KH-52, which doesn't exactly look like a helicopter, at least from the concept images I've seen, aren't. Although a stealthy KH-52 would be kind of interesting. Okay, so moving on to airborne now. One thing I wanted to suggest, and this really isn't a suggestion, as just more of like a why haven't they done this, is an upgrade option to give the rest of the infantry in the airborne spec the M7. And honestly, I think they could probably do this without it affecting the balance too much, because for half of with the Mark 19 and the M2 teams, you're literally just giving them 2 guns, or well, you're changing 2 guns. You're not giving them 2 more guns. So I'm not even sure that'd be worth 5 points. With the Stinger team, it might be worth 5 points because you're going up to 4 guns. With the airborne snipers, if you give the one guy, you swap out the M4A1 and the M203 with an M7 and a M320, I'm not sure how much of an effect it's going to have on the unit's capability, in all honesty. The same thing kind of goes with the tow launcher as well. 3 guys. No underbarrel grenade launchers. Is that worth 5 points? I don't know. The weapons team is the one where I can really see that you might actually have a point cost here. And conveniently, they do not have enough. They do not have a customization option. And honestly, half the reason why I mention this is because the weapons team is basically supposed to be a fire support squad. Pretty straightforward. But the M240 has the same range as the M250. And I'm pretty sure the same damage and the same pen as well. So you don't really have that. I mean, sure, you have two javelins, but you don't really have the extra. You don't have the extra range provided by the machine guns. But if you took the weapons team, you gave them a customization option for say 15 points, and you gave them 7 M7s and 2 of the MG 338s, which are the machine guns, the quasi 50 caliber machine guns that the Ranger fire support team, the Ranger Stingers or Ranger Javelin, Ranger Stingers or Ranger Javelin, depending on which customization option you pick. That could be interesting because that is a big machine gun. Well, it's got a longer range. It's shooting 338 Lapua. It's got a range equivalent to an M2 Browning, and you could give it basically to them to replace the 2 M240s. So 7 M7s, 2 338s, and 2 Javelins, or maybe 6 M7s, 1 M250, and then then 2 338s for about 15, maybe 20 points extra. On the subject of the M2 Browning, I've seen a lot of people basically argue to take the Mark 19 over the M2. And if I'm going to be entirely honest, it doesn't really help that the Mark 19 and the M2 are usually the same price customization wise. It's not that's not um that's not a constant. They are different prices in some specializations like the Marine Corps. The problem is that a lot of people argue that there's no reason to take the M2 Browning when the Mark 19 exists. And if I'm going to be entirely honest, I can see the point of their logic. Why would you take the Browning when the Mark 19 has the same range, better damage, and it has a blast radius? Why would you do that? So, if you want to make the M2 more competitive, one thing I'd recommend is give it some cover negation. I mean, it's a 50 BMG round. This thing turns concrete walls into confetti on a regular basis. Give it like 25% cover negation, or heck, maybe even 50% cover negation. That would make it more. That would make it better suited for shooting at things like infantry and buildings, whereas the Mark 19 would be better suited at shooting at things like light armor vehicles. At least that's the way that's the way that I think the problem could be solved. I suppose if you want to try and add a new unit to the airborne infantry, you could add the XM 1302, which was the BAE competitor in the MPF program, which produced the M10. Basically, it's a bit of a warmed over / modernized version of the M8. That said, though, I'm not sure what the XM02 would have that the M8 doesn't, except for maybe optics with the same range as the Set V3. The problem is that I'm not really sure that's enough to even warrant a new vehicle. The gun would basically be the same. I mean, you could maybe add an APS, but you can already add an APS to the M8. You could maybe add a 120, but you can already add a 120 to the M8. So you could do it, but I'm not sure what advantage you would get out of it. And it's not really like you can make it more heavily armored either. Now, one thing I don't want to suggest in this video is like buffs for existing units. I could suggest a number of them, but I don't want the video I don't want that to be what the video turns into. For example, give the Sheridan and the M113 the ability to swim, which, I mean, the whole reason why the Sheridan was selected over the T92 was because the Sheridan could swim. Or rather, the whole reason why the Sheridan was developed was because the T92 couldn't swim, the PT-76 could swim. The US looked at the PT-76, basically said, we need something that swims because the Soviets have something that swims, and then the Sheridan was developed as a response to that. And if memory serves, the PT-76 can swim in game. Where's the PT-76? There's the PT-76. Yes, the PT-76 can swim. Give the Sheridan the ability to swim. It's now, well, I say that. To be fair, we are talking about the Sheridan later in service when it was used with things like the 82nd, because the Sheridan could also be airdropped, like the PT-76. And I think the T-92 could have been airdropped as well. Just checked. Yes, the T-92 was designed to be airdroppable. But give the Sheridan the ability to swim, I guess. Actually, a new unit that you could add to the airborne infantry would be the T-92. It reached the prototype stage. It was armed with a 76mm gun, roughly on par with the PT-76. It could be airdropped. Just, I suppose you could add that as maybe as like a light fire support vehicle. Might be interesting, kind of like an airborne analog to the PT-76. Maybe for customization options, you can have the option of swapping out the 76mm gun for a 30mm autocannon, or maybe a 50mm autocannon. Maybe an armor package that removes the ability to be airdropped, or not. Or maybe trying to shoehorn an ATGM system in there somewhere, although I'm not entirely sure how. Although all of these would be fictional, but it's at least something to consider. Anyway, I don't really want to just try and spout buffs because that's not what I want this to that's not what I want this to become. Another thing that you could do with the airborne infantry is give it a book analog. Now, I use the term book analog very specifically because in the latest update 1.0.11, they referred to the slam ram as going from a book analog to a OSA or Tor analog. The thing is, firstly, I like the idea of having a small HIMAD system. HIMAD being an acronym, High to Medium Range Air Defense System. Basically, a big SAM rather than SHORAD, short range air defense. Well, they changed the slam ram quite a bit. Personally, I'm not particularly a fan of the changes. I think it should have been a. They basically turned it into a SHORAD system. So one thing that you could do, if you wanted to give the airborne infantry a big quote unquote SHORAD system, like OSA, like Tor, one thing you could do potentially is take the original slam ram concept, which is actually on the back of a Humvee, which I'd like to point out the airborne infantry uses, and turn that into the SHORAD. And then make the slam ram on the MTV chassis, which is the one in game, the HIMAD system. Alternatively, you could just put basically a NASAMS launcher on the back of a MTV. Would it be hypothetical / fictional? Well, yes. But Kongsberg, the company that makes the NASAMS, if memory serves, is trying to develop a quasi. They're trying to develop a missile or modifications to existing missiles to better suit the surface-to-air NASAMS system. One of the big selling points of NASAMS is that you could use conventional air-to-air missiles in it. And Kongsberg wants to develop, if not a new missile, then modifications to current air-to-air missiles to better suit the system. SlamRam was a development based off of the same technology as NASAMS. NASAMS stand for Norwegian Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile, I think. I'm not sure. But you could do something like that to get a book analog. And besides, I like the idea of having a relatively small, relatively cheap HIMAD air defense system. Another potential new unit that could be added to the airborne infantry specialization would be LOSAT. Now, you can find an artist impression of a LOSAT turret mounted to the hull of a CCVL, which is like the precursor to the M8 AGS, but ultimately the system was supposed to be mounted to the roof of a modified Humvee. The idea behind LOSAT being an acronym standing for Line of Sight Anti-Tank, but the idea behind LOSAT was that every ATGM system uses chemical energy to punch through armor. Things like shape charge, heat. I can try to explain it, but it's very complicated, and honestly, I don't know it all that well, so I'm certainly going to get something wrong. What makes LOSAT special is the way that it worked. Instead of using chemical energy, it would use kinetic energy, basically the same way that a sable run from a tank penetrates armor. The idea was that you take a missile, a very, very, very fast missile, and then you put a solid core inside of it. You fire the missile at very high speed at the target, and it would use kinetic energy to punch through the target. As for how this works in game, I assume it would work basically the same way Sabo does. But the exact values, I'm not sure. Sabo ammunition does 6 damage, unless it's fired out of a 105, which in that case it only does 5.5. But the pen values, firstly, it would act like Sabo in that the pen values would fluctuate with distance. You would think that it wouldn't do this because it's powered by a rocket motor, but rocket motors don't power the thing they're attached to throughout the entire duration of their flight. they fire for a short period of time, producing a lot of thrust over a short period of time, and then the missile coasts with the remaining energy once the rocket motor burns out. Honestly, if you want to make it particularly realistic, what you might see is something like the missile has very, very low pen right after it's launched, and then the pen value goes up sharply until the rocket motor burnout, at which point it slowly goes down in the same way that a sable round from a tank does. But that'd be a particularly complicated way of doing it, so doubt it. I doubt it'd be worth it. The pen values for the M829A2 Sable round are between 475 and 760. That might be a good place to put the low sats pen values at. That are either the 500 to 800 of the M829A3. As for the launcher itself, personally, I'd prefer it to be its own separate vehicle rather than a upgrade slash side grade of the M8. Although if you put the M1302 in the game, you could argue for it being an upgrade slash side grade of the M8. But I'd prefer it remain as its own standalone vehicle. Alternatively, you can make two versions of the vehicle. After doing a bit of research, I did find that the system was supposed to be mounted to Humvee with 4 shots. You can do that as a light low-sat with 4 missiles, and then a version mounted on an M8 chassis with 8 missiles as a heavy low-sat. The last thing I'm wondering about is how the system would interact with active protection systems. Modern active protection systems can't reliably stop a kinetic energy projectile, so would they be able to stop low-sat? I don't know. It'd be interesting to see how the devs handle it. Another potentially interesting addition that I also forgot until just now would be the B1R, or regional. So basically, the idea behind the B1R is as a regional bomber. The Air Force wanted something that wasn't quite strategic. So the idea was to take a B-1B Lancer, install the F-119 engines of the F-22 Raptor into it, which would have increased its maximum speed to about Mach 2.2 from, I can't remember how fast the B-1B is. I want to say Mach 1.6 at altitude. It would have increased its maximum speed to about Mach 2.2. It would have reduced the range by about 20%. And they also would have modified it to allow it to carry air-to-air missiles externally. So that might be interesting. The idea of a B-1B variant that can't quite carry as much ordnance, but would be faster and have the ability to carry air-to-air missiles, so it could potentially defend itself against hostile aircraft. And plus, the idea of having a second bomber available to you could make deck customization very interesting. Now that I think about it, another option which would be kind of interesting for the airborne would be the F-15 SE, or the Silent Eagle. Basically, imagine an F-15 that has been made stealthy. You wouldn't be able to carry many missiles, maybe 4 or 2 and some small bombs, but it would be stealthy, potentially to the same level as the F-22. Maybe. But you can only carry 4 air-to-air missiles. Also, it wouldn't have conformal fuel tanks, because the space that the conformal fuel tanks would normally take up, that's where the weapon bays are. So, fuel capacity and loader time would be closer to an F-15C without any fuel tanks rather than an F-15EX. And you carry, again, if memory serves, about 4 air-to-air missiles. You could use some of the weapons base to carry small, like 500-pound or maybe 1,000-pound bombs, but it would predominantly be air-to-air missiles. The idea is like a cheap, stealthy fighter. On the subject of stealth, another idea that, and this is something I've been wanting to see for a while, is to have a customization option to allow us to select stealth aircraft and make them non-stealthy, but give us the opportunity to use their external hardpoints. I might have already mentioned this somewhere before, but you can generally double the number of hardpoints on a stealthy aircraft if you use the external hardpoints. For example, the F-35A and the F-35C have 6 internal hardpoints. They also have 6 external hardpoints. The F-35B has 4 internal hardpoints, but 6 external hardpoints. The SU-57, the F-22, the J-20, all of those, if memory serves, have 4 external hardpoints. And if you want to use the double missile launcher that you see on things like the F-15, or not the F-15, the FA-18C when you equip it with AMRAAMs, you could basically double an F-22's missile load. Of course, the downside is that you're no longer stealthy. The problem with that is, short of making an entirely different or a copy of the aircraft just with the change or just and then just changing the stealth, I'm not sure how you'd implement it, because I don't know if the customization system is robust enough to add or remove customization options depending on other customization options. I don't see anything in the game so far that tells me that it is. As for Striker Cav, I have a few options that I think might be interesting. One idea I did want to share, and I highlighted this in one of my previous, I think it was the video looking over the update 1.10 patch changes, was the Striker SPH. Now, the Striker SPH did actually exist. It was prototyped, and it has a 105. I believe it has a 105 in real life. But one idea for an upgrade that I want to see is the ability to take the 105 and swap it out for a 155. And the idea is basically take give it the same basic performance as what you might see on Brutus. So it doesn't have the extended range of the 105. It might be something like you see on Brutus or the A6 Paladin. I mean, heck, you might have an ammunition loadout of, say... Actually, what's the ammunition loadout on the A6 Paladin? What is it? It's 24 regular HE, 9 smoke, and then 3 guided. So, maybe 24 regular HE and 9 smoke. That's 33 rounds. The regular SPH has 56. But you basically, you fit the 39mm 155. Or caliber, not millimeter, without any sort of range buff. And the basic idea here is you have a slightly shorter range, but a bigger boom on the other end. It would be a simple upgrade. I'm not sure if it would up the vehicle cost. Theoretically, it wouldn't, because again, you're paying for the bigger boom with a shorter range and maybe less accuracy. I mean, the dispersion for the Striker SPH is 200 meters vertical and 150 horizontal. The dispersion for the A6 Paladin is 280 meters vertical and 210 horizontal. So it isn't as accurate. The dispersion for Brutus is, which is basically a M777 on the back of a MTV, is 280 vertical and 210 horizontal as well. So you're missing out on some accuracy, and you're missing out on a bit of range, but again, you have a bigger boom. I think that could be an interesting upgrade. Another potential customization option, this time for the Striker ICV, would be an option for the M1304. The M1304 in reality is the successor to the M1296, otherwise known as the Dragoon, both of which basically being the IFE version of the Striker with the 30mm Bushmaster. Now, the firepower is basically the same between the two. They both have the same Bushmaster, they both have the same 7.62mm coax, and neither of them carry any sort of ATGMs. So I suppose you might get more ammunition with the 1304, and maybe better optics to a view range of, say, 1400 meters from the 1200 base. Aside from that, there wouldn't be that much difference, so I don't expect the price to be higher. At least not by much. If the base Dragoon is 20 points, then the 1304 upgrade might be 25, maybe 30. I suppose it would depend on how much you actually get, but still, I don't expect it to be a lot. I think that could be an interesting upgrade option at the very least. Actually, speaking of the strikers, the devs could take a page out of the Bradley playbook if they wanted to. The strikers were built in three variants or groups, for lack of a better term. You had the regular versions, which were built first, and then when it was found that they weren't particularly good against IEDs, you then had the double V hull version. Then you had the double V hull A1, which is basically just like a double V hull that has been heavily upgraded. And you can kind of do something similar to what they did with the Bradleys here. Your regular strikers would be akin to your A2 Bradleys, and then your V hull strikers would be akin to your A3s, and you have the option of upgrading them to double V hull A1s, which is like upgrading your A3 Bradleys to your A4 Bradleys, possibly with a speed boost, because one of the most notable change about the A1 Strikers was that they replaced a 350 horsepower engine with a 450 horsepower engine. As for what this would do, maybe the regular Strikers only get access to to the reactive armor, and the Mark 19 or empty Browning on the Crows, while the the double V hull strikers get access to both the Mark 19 and or the Crows and the Crows Javelin variants where applicable, and the active protection system. As for now, that would mainly apply to the ICV and the ESV. Heck, I'm not even sure if it would apply to the RV. I don't think the Striker RV was included in the V variants. I know the RV wasn't included in the regular double V hull, and as for the A1, interestingly enough, the fire support variant of the Striker was included, which, if memory serves, is basically to provide surveillance and communications, but that's not the RV variant. So they could do something like that. I think that would be kind of interesting. One thing or it's worth noting that the ATGM vehicle is also included in this, and I'm not entirely sure how you would work the upgrade for that, unless you give it a speed boost like you do with the Bradleys. It's worth noting that the MGS, however, is not. It was never the MGSs were never upgraded to double V hull standard and much less double V hull A1. So maybe you could just hand wave it. I don't know. That's probably what I'd do. If memory serves, the developer said they wanted to make the game realistic, but also fun at the same time. So, but I think that's an interesting idea that they could do. Sure, it might make it a little bit more complex, but it also make things a little bit deeper, because you would have the same choice with the strikers that you do with the Bradleys. You could either go with a cheap transport that's okay, but again is kind of cheap, or you can go with the more expensive but more advanced version. Sure, it's not quite the same quality jump as with the Bradleys, but it would still be an option. As for the Striker Dragoon, I believe that was only mounted on the double V hull versions. So what you would basically do is that would only be available for the double V hull version of the ISV the ICV, which is the M1256 versus the M1126, which is the regular version. So, and this would also presumably the upgrade of the Dragoon that I suggested, the M1304, would also be only available on the M1256 ISV version. But yeah, I suppose that could be a worthwhile addition. It'd certainly be interesting to see how people use it, if at all. I can also think of a few potential upgrade options for the Booker. The first would basically be add-on armor. Things like ERA. Think Tusk, Busk, or SRAT. It's worth noting that Tusk stands for Tank Urban Survival Kit, Busk stands for Bradley Urban Survival Kit, and SRAT stands for Striker Reactive Armor Tiles. Tusk and Busk are technically misnomers because they don't just refer to the add-on armor, they also refer to other improvements like, for example, the installation of a Crows or an M2 Browning mounted over the barrel. But for the Booker, I suppose you could call it Brat or Booker Reactive Armor Tiles, kind of like SRAT. Of course, if you did that, you'd get it mixed up with the other Brat, which stands for Bradley Reactive Armor Tiles. Anyway, I digress. The idea is fairly simple. You just have an add-on armor package in the same way you have it on Striker. Also, as an aside, I can't help but notice that it's called Strat 2 on the Strikers. And my previous idea with using with splitting the Strikers up between the base variants and then the B-hull variants, like splitting the Bradleys up between the A2 and the A3, you might make the armor package on the base variants called the Strat 1 and slightly less effective. Anyway, again, I digress. The idea it's very simple. You just put add-on armor on the Booker. I think the thing that would be most interesting would be whether or not the reactive armor tiles just cover the sides and function the same way you have on the Abrams, where it just increases the side armor, or if they also cover the front, like on the Bradley and the Striker. Because if they cover the front, you can do things like increasing the heat protection to maybe 1,000 or possibly even 1,100, and maybe increasing the kinetic protection to about 400 to 450. That said, more than likely it's probably just going to cover the sides. It would be interesting if it did cover the front, though. Another option, and honestly I'm a bit hesitant to suggest this, would be giving the Booker 120mm gun. Now, the Army did look at giving the Booker a 120, but they decided that the 105 was plenty good enough. And I've seen a lot of people claiming, well, if the Booker's a tank, they should just give it the 120. The Booker's not a tank. The Booker was never intended to be a tank. The Booker was intended to basically be an assault gun. It's not supposed to do the same jobs as a tank. Now, to be fair, that's what I've heard. I don't know what kind of jobs a tank does, or at least I don't know all of them. And I don't know what kind of or all the jobs that a Booker's supposed to do. That's just what I've heard. That's what the Army has said, and I'm going to go with what the Army has said because they're the ones who developed the darn thing. But I suppose you could add a 120. As for what the 120 would be armed with, I don't think, if they do add a 120, I would be kind of surprised if it is armed with the same kind of ammunition that the 120 on the M8 is armed with the good rounds, like the Set V3 is equipped with. Actually, one thing I suppose you could do is you could give it the HE round and the heat, and then leave Sabo at home in order to de-emphasize its use against things like heavy armored vehicles like tanks, because you don't have anything that's good at penetrating armor like Sabo does. Of course, having anything that stacks up to the 50mm autocan is going to be a bit of a challenge. On the subject of the Booker, and the M8, I guess, and to be fair, this would err onto the into the territory of buff, but at least it's something I suppose I could suggest, would be to add a better version of the 105mm round. The 105mm round on... And basically what I mean is split the round up into basically two types. There's 4 vehicles that the US have that shoot the 105. The M60A1, the M8 AGS, the Striker MGS, and the Booker with the 105. And all of them are the same. They all have 5.5 damage, and the penetration value ranges from 520 to 325. I think the damage is okay. Also, as an aside, the Rapara in the Coastal Troop Specialization on the BMOP has the same penetration figures, but it only does 5 damage. Although that's technically a 100mm gun. As near as I could tell, it wouldn't make any difference. But the idea I have is to keep the damage the same at 5.5, but raise the pen values from 520 or the pen range from 520 and 325 to maybe 625 to 400, or 600 to 400, something like that. You're still nowhere near the value of even the M829A1 on an Abrams, which is 450 to 720, but it is more pen, and it would be good enough to handle even the suckier Russian tanks. And for that matter, and I don't, one thing you could do, and I don't necessarily consider this a buff, as it would be an actual customization option for all of the Abrams, is give them another customization option to basically dictate what kind of Sabo round they use. Well, what version of the M829 they use. Either the A1, A2, A3, A4. Because I don't know of any physical reason why you couldn't take a basic bog standard M1A2 or an M1A1 heavy common and not put the A4 Sabo into it. At the same time, I also can't think of any reason why you couldn't take something like Sat V3 and not put the A1 Sabo into it. So the idea is that you could potentially create a quasi-tank destroyer by giving a otherwise cheap and potentially somewhat squishy, or possibly even sucky, tank a good gun. That said, it might mess with the balance of the specialization, so I suppose I can understand why you would be hesitant to do that, especially since there's nothing stopping the players from selecting the good ammunition across the board, which would probably start airing into OP territory unless the good stuff was made particularly expensive. One thing I could suggest, particularly for HIMARS, would be something like the GLSDB, a ground launched small diameter bomb. And there's two ways that I can see you taking this. Either the idea is as a particularly long-ranged version of the MLRS rocket, although 6 kilometers is still long-ranged in general, but maybe something like 7,000, 7,500, but it makes it equally more expensive. We're talking about something probably close to the Tornado S in cost. Alternatively, and this might be the other option, would be to basically turn it into to treat each individual GLSDB rocket like a mini ballistic missile. The idea is that the damage isn't all that greater than the Stormbreakers on aircraft, but they have a range of like 7 kilometers, and you can fire 6 of them. The problem is if you do that, you're not going to have, or at least this is kind of how I imagine some players are going to use it. But if you kit them out like that, you're not going to have people treating it like a bunch of mini cruise missiles. What you're probably going to have people doing is treating it as an excellent way to saturate air defenses, probably in junction with things like other cruise and ballistic missile uses, because they did say that they wanted to reduce the amount of cruise and ballistic missile spam, and I honestly I understand that quite a bit. So I suppose that could be an idea, but I'm not entirely sure how it would work out. Another thing I could suggest, and I think I mentioned this all the way back in the video where I first took a look at the Striker Cav specialization, would be to separate the M1117 between the M1117 and the M1200 Armored Knight, which, if memory serves, was how it was in the press build. I don't know why they... I said it before, I'll say it again. I don't know why they combined the two. The battleship... If you want to add more gun trucks, and I don't really see them doing this because the battleship doesn't appear to be super popular. If you want to add more gun trucks, you can base them off the 5-ton truck. Particularly if you want to add, like, well, no, this would fit more of a specialization that's full of 1960s and 70s era equipment, because that's when gun trucks really took off. There were some gun truck-like vehicles developed by the British and the Soviets during World War II, but those were less gun trucks and more mobile pillboxes. It wasn't until Vietnam that the idea of a gun truck, as we understand it today, really came came to fruition. And granted, if you want to add 1970s style, or if you want to add Vietnam era style gun trucks, it might not be the most realistic. It could be fun, but if you do that, you can add all kinds of other weapons: a quad 50 cal, twin 40 millimeter anti-aircraft guns. There's one Eve of Destruction that has a twin M2 Browning mount off of a warship. And I heard one story, and I don't have any way of confirming this, that one gun truck crew apparently tried to acquire a quad 40 mil a quad 40 millimeter Bofors anti-aircraft gun mount, like the same kinds you see on World War II era warships. It didn't work, but they tried. I think they asked the Navy for it, and the Navy was like, "Why? No, go away." But it would have been hilarious, and it would be pretty fun in game, I think. Another idea for a new unit, and this would go with both the U.S. and Russia, like a new type of unit, would be engineering vehicles. And honestly, I think this is one area which they kind of dropped the ball on, because if you have engineering vehicles, well, firstly, what would engineering vehicles do? And I think one idea, because you might initially look at the game and think, well, why would we have engineering vehicles? And when I say engineering vehicles, I'm not talking about something like the M728 CEV with the sodding great big demolition charge launcher on the front. I mean things like like the M88 or the engineering version of the AAVP or the ACV or the Striker, or the various engineering vehicles that the Russians developed. I believe there's an engineering version of the T-72. I think there's an engineering version of the T-90. I know that one of the few vehicles that we know about that's supposed to use the Armada chassis is supposed to be an engineering vehicle. So there's lots of things that they can pick from here, but why would you add them in the first place? And the answer would be a bit niche, but I think it would be kind of interesting. And the idea is that it's a vehicle that has a certain amount of, I'm going to call them spares to separate them from supplies, but they have a certain amount of spares on board, and they will automatically repair any damaged modules, any damaged or destroyed modules on vehicles nearby if they aren't moving. So if you have an armored vehicle like a tank or something like that gets banged up and it can't move or whatnot, you can drive the engineering vehicle up to it, stop, and much like with supplies, it can then repair the vehicle's modules. It can't heal the vehicle. Well, it might be able to heal the vehicle a little bit. It certainly wouldn't be able to rearm the vehicle, but it would be able to repair the modules and allow the vehicle to keep moving again. I think that's an interesting idea. Although, in hindsight, maybe the term recovery vehicle would be better than engineering vehicle. On the subject, I suppose you could also talk about things like ammunition resupply vehicles for artillery. And a lot of them use artillery chassis. The M998, if memory serves, would be a US equivalent for something like the M109. And the idea here is kind of the same. The ammunition supply vehicle carries a certain amount of ammunition, which it can then transfer to any artillery piece within range. Now, this functionally wouldn't be any different than just putting a supply point down right next to your artillery and then having them resupply natively like that, but it could be more interesting, I guess. It doesn't necessarily have a point, but it could be more interesting. But if you really want to tackle this whole game-wide addition idea, there's a couple other types of units that I could think of that could be added. For example, there's AWACS aircraft, planes that have a massive view range, and possibly even the ability to see things on the ground, but are big and slow and unarmed. There's also potentially tanker aircraft, planes that can increase the loiter time of aircraft in their vicinity at least to a certain point, but are also big and slow and unarmed, and which may or may not come with the tiny issue of blowing up any aircraft in its immediate vicinity when it explodes. There's also the idea of support infantry. And a prime example I could give would be something like a mortar team. And the idea here is that maybe you have a mortar carrier, something like a AMPV mortar carrier or a striker mortar carrier, and that when the vehicle stops, you can deploy a team of mortarmen out the back, and they can with maybe things like a 60 millimeter mortar or an 81 millimeter mortar, or maybe even a 107 millimeter mortar. The 60 millimeter mortar might have a range of, say, only 1,500 meters. But the idea is that maybe the mortar team can engage targets on their own autonomously. Alternatively, it would be another source of indirect fires for the player to use. The downside is that you honestly start to open a can of worms that I'm not really sure is a good idea to open. Because if you can make the argument that the mortar teams should go in the support tab because that's where the mortar carriers are, then it wouldn't be much of a stretch to make the argument that things like Manpad's team should also go in the support tab because that's where the ground-based air defense systems are. And I'm not entirely sure that would be a good idea. Alternatively, particularly when you look at some of the stuff the Russians have, you can make the argument that if the mortar teams go in the infantry tab, then the mortar carriers should be vehicles exclusive to their use in much the same way that a Manpad's team might have a BTR-ZD that they can get in instead of a BMD. And I'm honestly not sure that would be good for the game. Like, the idea of trying to split hairs that much. Because A, it doesn't seem like it's a good idea in the first place, and B, you're diluting your infantry tab. Unless you collectively want to remove like 250 or even 500 points for the support tab and put them in the infantry tab to compensate, which, honestly, I'm not particularly a fan of. Another idea that I am a fan of, or I say a fan of, that I want to see, or at least I want to, an idea that I want to be considered, is the ability to assign infantry to any transport vehicle within the deck. Like, when you're making the deck, assign infantry to any transport vehicle within the deck. I'm not saying the ability to assign mechanized engineers to regular Bradleys. So if you wanna assign them to ESVs, that's fine. Or assign recon troops to regular vehicles, or vice versa. Assign regular infantry to recon troops. But here's an example of what I'm thinking. Say I want to make a deck with a airborne cav deck with airborne infantry and strikers that I intend to throw out the back of perfectly good airplanes. The problem is that while I can throw the infantry out the back of perfectly good airplanes just fine, and I can put them in my deck just fine, if I want to put the ICV strikers in my deck so I can throw them out the back of the plane, I need to bring troopers along. Now, this doesn't necessarily seem like a problem. I mean, at the very least, you can use them as defensive infantry. But what if I don't need the troopers? What if I am already bringing along, say, Stingers teams and weapon squads? Because you can throw them out the back of a plane too, and arguably they're better. At that point, the troopers just become a tumor, for lack of a better term, a drag on the amount of points available. And it doesn't really help that if I want to bring along 4 ICVs, I need to bring along 4 troopers of some kind. and that's just massively inconvenient. Now, I could kind of see why they've done this, because I suppose it makes something in the game's code simpler. At the same time, as a quality of life improvement, it would certainly be interesting, and it would allow players more flexibility with how they build their decks. So, at least for me, or at least as far as I'm concerned, it should be something that should be worth considering at the very least. Another potential game-wide idea, albeit one that might not necessarily increase the fun factor, would be the idea that add-on armor increases a vehicle's weight. Because vehicle weight doesn't seem to change very much. It's just a basic metric used to see if a vehicle can be hauled by something. But the idea is that if you add on armor, you increase the vehicle's weight. And okay, the whole point to do this would be pretty niche. It's so that, oh look, the Chinook can sling load the unarmored MML, but once you put the B kit armor onto it, the Chinook can't sling load it anymore. That would basically be the whole point of it. And sure, it might not be fun, but it would be potentially interesting. Then again, it doesn't seem like a lot of people use B kit armor packages on transports anyway. Anyway, on to SOCOM. There's a few things I'm going to mention, or I could mention with SOCOM, and the first thing I'm going to mention is probably going to make a lot of people cry, and I cannot wait to feast on their tears. The RQ-170 is probably one of the more divisive units in game. Some people like it, other people hate it. I'm about to suggest an RQ-170 on steroids. It's called the RQ-180. Imagine a drone with the same stealth as the RQ-170, but with the same optics as the Global Hawk. Yeah, that's pretty much it. But that's basically exactly what the RQ-180 is. The RQ-180 is designed to fulfill the same basic role as the Global Hawk. That role being a stupidly long-range, high-altitude reconnaissance UAV. Probably not only difference, but the biggest difference is that while the Global Hawk has a radar cross-section the size of a small apartment building, the RQ-180 does not. The RQ-180 is much, much, much stealthier. Oh, that's interesting. So I have Broken Arrow up, and I'm scrolling through the units as I talk about this. Apparently, in the background audio, they've added the new soundtracks for the zombie game mode, and one just started playing instead of the normal stuff. Anyway, I digress. So the Global Hawk, take the RQ-170, copy its stats except for the optics, make that the same values as the Global Hawk. Also, on the subject of the Global Hawk, I understand why they nerfed it in between the November beta and release. I honestly think the price nerf was incredibly justified, because having what you had for only 100 points was flat out OP. But it really bugs me that they nerfed the optics from 6500 to 5500, because then it's only a 1000 meter difference from things like the Gray Eagle, and that bugs me, if I'm gonna be honest. Also, it occurs to me just now that the Gray Eagle and the Reaper have about the same icon, and so does the Predator. They'll probably change that in an update or two. Anyway, take something like the RQ-170, make it bigger, and give it the optics of the Global Hawk. It would be great. It would make so many people upset. It would be hilarious. Just. And to be fair, I'm probably finding this funny because I've never been on the receiving end of a RQ-170. I probably never have, but still. Honestly, the RQ-170 and people just telling their sniper teams to hold fire is probably what the real reason behind half of the cheaters that a lot of people will usually like to point out. Anyway, RQ-180, it'd be hilarious. It would also be borderline OP. So if the RQ-170 is like 200 points, I fully expect the RQ-180 to be 250 at minimum, maybe 275. It would be fun, though. I suppose you could also add the General Atomics Avenger, but I don't really see why, and I'm probably going to suggest that in one of my other videos for a new specialization. Other things you could add, potentially the B-21. I mean, that has reached the functional prototype stage as maybe like a B2 that's slightly smaller, even stealthier, can only carry maybe about half as many or half as much ordnance, but again is much stealthier. So maybe only 8 ALCMs or guided bombs or things like that, or one GBU-57. It might still be able to carry a nuclear weapon. On the subject of a nuclear weapon, and I can't remember if I mentioned this before, I kind of wish there was an option, and this goes back to what I was saying about I don't know how well the customization system is going to be able to handle certain customization options being enabled or disabled depending on the choices made with other customization options. But with the B-52, if they add something like the Tu-95 and they give it a nuclear weapon, so to bring both the U.S. and Russia up to having 2 nuclear weapons, they're probably going to make it a missile because the Tu-95 is big and slow and is about as stealthy as an apartment block. But if they're going to do that, why not do the same thing with the B-52? The idea here is remove the cruise missile, remove the KH-102 from the Tu-160, give it a freefall bomb, give the Tu-95 the KH-102, give the B-52 an air-launched version of the or a nuclear-tipped version of the ALCM, or maybe the AGM 188 LRSO, or 181 LRSO if memory serves. Although I don't think that has actually reached prototype stage yet. And the idea is that bombers that are either fast or stealthy have freefall nuclear bombs. Bombers that are not have cruise missiles. Although I don't really see that happening. It's just an idea. Anyway, another thing I suppose I could mention would be something like the ripsaw. I'm not entirely sure how that would work. Well, actually, I know how it would work. It would basically be like a mini tank with an RWS on top. Although I'm not entirely sure how that would be too different from the MATV. I mean, it might not have the same road speed as the MATV, but it might be a whole lot better off-road. The way road versus cross-country mobility seems to work in Broken Arrow is that vehicles, regardless of whether they're wheeled or tracked, lose speed when they're not driving on roads. But the amount of speed they lose seems to change. A wheeled vehicle has its speed reduced by about 50% when it's driving off-road, but a tracked vehicle only has its speed reduced by about 25%. Now, the M8TV in-game moves at 105 kilometers an hour, and it has an on-road and has an off-road speed of 50 kilometers an hour. The Ripsaw, which has about the same speed, 105 kilometers an hour, in real life, might move at, say, 75 kilometers an hour off-road. So it's not faster than the M8TV on-road, but it would be the fastest thing in the game off-road. As for what it could be armed with, I already mentioned an RWS. You could probably start out with something basic, like a minigun, and then maybe go up to an M2 Browning or a Mark 19, and then maybe a 30mm M230, like what the GMC Flyer has. I believe there's even some variants with a turret with what appears to be a 25mm Bushmaster on it, but that might be going a little bit too far. You could also theoretically install a Javelin on the RWS in the same way you can install a Javelin on the RWS on the MATV, but that might be going a little bit too far for what is supposed to be a reconnaissance vehicle. Then again, if the MATV can mount a Javelin, I suppose the Ripsaw could? If the MATV can mount one, then I guess there wouldn't be anything wrong with it. Another suggestion might be with the Rangers. In a previous, I believe when I was looking over the update 1.10 balance changes, I noted that they upped the damage for the M4A1, and I pointed out that instead of upping the damage, if they want to make it competitive with something like Airborne, they need to up the range. And so I think one thing that they might do, or they might want to do, is basically have an option to take the Rangers and give them scars, like the Scar 17. Give them things like the Scar 17. Actually, where the Ranger RRC is kind of kitted out like this in standoff. Give them the Scar 17 with a 600-meter range. It gives 7.62 millimeter light machine gun, some DMRs, maybe with a 700-meter range. That, or you could just give them the MRGG, either the MRGG-A or the MRGG-S, or the 6.5 Creedmoor LMG. Basically, what Delta Force has, or what Pararescue have. Give them something like that. But I'm honestly more inclined to do something like the Scars. Give the Scar 17 with the 7.62, the grenade launcher. What is it? Mark 13, the Scar 17, and then a Scar DMR, which would probably be at the same range. I don't think there's a Scar DMR that goes out to 700. And or honestly, the Scar H in the Rangers RRC squad only have a range of 500 meters. I suppose you could do something like that. And one thing I saw someone suggest, and I think this is an interesting idea, is give them a sniper rifle. I don't mean anything complicated. Something like an M40 or an M210. Nothing super complicated. But the idea was that it's basically a counterpart to the SSO team that Russia has, because in its long range they have a sniper, like a legitimate sniper rifle. I think, and I saw someone suggest that as a counterpart, and I think that they actually have a point. That might be interesting. So you could do something like that with Rangers as an upgrade option. Obviously, this is going to raise the price of Rangers. If you want to give them Scars, although if you give them Scars and a 7.62 millimeter machine gun and Scar 17s for their DMR, you're going to be raising the range, but I'm not sure how much that would affect their performance. Depending on the amount of damage, it might not affect their performance all that much. The damage between the Mark 48 and the M249 Para isn't that high. And actually, I think it's the same. And the Scar Mark 20 does 1.8 damage, where the Scar H DMR does 1.5. The Scar H, however, does 1.35 damage, and the URG M4A1 does 1.8. So Rangers are going to be mulching enemy infantry if they get within range. The problem is if they get within range. And personally, I'm more inclined to trust standoff than big damage up close. So I suppose you could do that. Then again, that kind of errs into territory of buff and not new customization option, and I already said that I don't really want to harp on buffs. So alongside their close quarters, you could do something like this alongside their close quarters loadout. You might have like close quarters and then regular and then standoff, where they have the sniper rifle or two. Another idea, and I'm gonna suggest this, even though I don't really frame it like a buff, but one thing they could do with Delta Force that I kind of like to see is just remove the Fletcher launcher, because I'm honestly not sure how useful this thing would be. It doesn't have any pen, and I highly doubt it's going to be useful against any remotely heavily armored vehicle. Just dump the Fletcher launcher, give another guy a MRGGA, and then maybe give the squad a couple of Carl Gustavs. The M3E1. Not the Raws, the M3E1. And honestly, if you did that and you wanted to raise the price for the standoff up to 120, I'd understand that. And as an aside, and I think I might have already mentioned this, when it comes to the SOCOM helicopters, I would like an option for the door guns on all of them, the MH-47, the MH-60 DAP, and the regular MH-60, to have the option to mount the GAU-19B. I think that could be fun, especially the MH-47G. Just having like two of them on each side, that could be fun. As an aside, I do realize that a lot of the stuff that I suggest could be considered as buffs, but I don't really want them to be. For example, the thing I suggested a second ago about Delta Force with scrapping the Fletcher launcher and just giving them a couple of Carl Gustavs, I can understand how a lot of people could see that as a buff, and honestly, that's kind of how it's phrased. Personally, I just think that the Fletcher launcher is not very useful, but I could be very wrong. And if anyone does find a use for it, then great. Me personally, I just don't think it's particularly useful. Anyway, I digress. And honestly, I could say the same thing about the AT-4s that the basic trooper squad has in Striker Cav. Personally, I would trade all three of those AT-4s for a couple extra Javelin missiles, but that's just me. Anyway, again, I digress. But I'm not really trying to say, oh, this needs to be buffed, or that needs to be better, or I like this, so I want it to be better. I'm not trying to say that. Mainly, I'm trying to suggest things that I think would offer a new dimension of gameplay for a certain unit. For example, I mentioned the Sheridan's ability to swim. That wouldn't necessarily affect the Sheridan itself, I don't think, but it would offer some interesting interoperability with something like the Marine Corps specialization. Another example of this would probably be the M113s. There's 5 M113 variants in the game. The M113A3, the M1064A3, the M163 PVEDs, the M901A3, and the M981 Fist V. One thing that I want to suggest that I'm honestly hesitant to because it sounds like a buff, and it technically would be to allow the M113s to swim. This would offer more interoperability with the Marine Corps specialization, and the M113 was designed to swim, much like the Sheridan was. Granted, much like the Sheridan, as it was used in the 1980s by the 82nd Airborne, I don't know if the M113A3 could still swim, but I know that the base version could. Well, the M113A3 and the other derivatives that appear in the game. So I want to suggest giving them amphibious capability, again, like with the Sheridan, but that would technically be a buff, and I don't want this video to be about buff, so I'm honestly hesitant to make that suggestion. It's something I would like to see, but it does kind of conflict with the ground rules, so to speak, that I laid down for the video. Anyway, aside over. Another thing that could be considered for SOCOM would be a new MC-130 variant. The MC-130H, the one that's currently in SOCOM, was developed in the 1980s. It's the third aircraft in the MC-130 line, there's 5 of them in total, after the MC-130E, if memory serves, which is the first, and then the MC-130P, I think, which is basically like an aerial tanker version of the MC-130. Or rather, it was a previous aerial tanker aircraft that was converted to multi-mission standard. The M in U.S. military parlance designates multi-mission, which is usually, but not always, used to identify a piece of equipment as being intended for use in, for lack of a better term, special operations. But the MC-130H is the third aircraft in line out of 5. The latest variant is the MC-130J. Now, I don't want to see the MC-130H go away. I like it in the game. I think it looks interesting. And the big funky nose on the aircraft, that's actually a terrain mapping radar. The whole point behind it is that excuse me. The whole point behind it is that the aircraft it's so the aircraft can fly at low altitude in bad weather. It can fly at low altitude in bad weather or at night through things like canyons or valleys without the plane slamming into the ground, so you can do secret squirrel stuff. If you look at something like the MH-60, the MH-60 DAP, or the MH-47, you'll see similar dome-like structures at the front, which are, again, terrain mapping radars used for the same purpose. So one thing you could do is you could add the MH or the MC-130J, which is the latest variant of the MC-130 series. There's like 5 aircraft. The MC-130W would later became, I think, the AC-130W, or at least would serve as the basis for it. And the MC-130J is related to the KC-130J from the Marine Corps specialization. In fact, I think it's a. I honestly, I think it is a special forces version. Well, for lack of a better term, you could put that in there, and I could talk about how the MC-130H is 200 points, and yet the KC-130 does everything it can do just without the ECM for 25 points less, or how the C-130J30 can do everything the actually can do more than what the MC-130H can do for 15 points less. But again, I don't want to talk about things like buffs, even if I do think a price reduction might be a little bit warranted. But for the MC-130J, maybe make it a bit better than the MC-130H and make it a bit more expensive. And then for both aircraft, give it an option to have a heavy lift capability and to transport troops, or to carry a MOAB. Yes, we're going there. Would a MOAB be necessarily practical? Not really. Would it be fun? Absolutely. And we've actually used it in service in like 2017, if memory serves. We plastered a ISIS training camp with one. It was hilarious. And the MOAB, the largest bomb in the game is the FAB 9000. And if memory serves, the FAB 9000 has a... Where's the FAB 9000? Where's the TU-160? There's the TU-160. The FAB 9000 has like 175 damage and a 350 meter blast radius and 300 millimeters of pen. The best that the MOAB, or not the MOAB, but the MOP, that the B2 drops, does 130 damage with 260 meter blast radius and 225 pen. Now, the MOAB is a thermobaric bomb, and thermobaric bombs have less pen, oftentimes much less pen, but have greater damage and a larger blast radius than their non-thermobaric equivalents. In fact, if I can find a Russian aircraft, I'll give you an example of what this is. Okay, so you've got a 500 kilogram thermobaric bomb and a... Well, you've got 500 kilogram smart bomb, so it should do the same damage. So you've got the 500 kilogram thermobaric, which is top attack, only does 15 millimeters of pen versus the 70 millimeters of the conventional HE 500 kilogram bomb. But the blast radius is slightly larger, and the damage is more than twice as much. In fact, I think the damage is about twice as much. So the MOAB might be looking at something like a 400 meter blast radius and, I don't know, 250 damage, or like a 425 meter blast radius and 200 damage. Although I expect the pen to be like 150. Would it be an effective weapon? I don't know. Would it be a practical weapon, particularly in the sort of peer-on-peer or peer-on-near-peer warfare that the game depicts? Not really, no. Would it be fun? Very much so. Lastly, another thing I wanted to mention was the Sky Warden, or the Sky Ranger 2. I'm kind of surprised this wasn't in the SOCOM specialization before I'm kind of surprised this wasn't in the SOCOM specialization from the start. But basically what it is it's a crop duster that has been militarized, for lack of a better term. It's slow. It would probably only be limited to low altitude flight, maybe. No, actually, doesn't necessarily need to be. The thing doesn't even have an ejection seat. No, it has a roll cage, like a car, like a race car. The thing is, it flies so slow and from such a relatively low altitude that if it was legitimately shot down, The roll cage would keep the pilot alive. I'm not kidding. It does not have an ejection seat. It has a roll cage. When I say this is a militarized crop duster, I'm not kidding. And what you would have is basically like a combination between a UAV, like, the Reaper, and the A-10. You could kit it out with guns. Maybe it would have the ability to see ground targets on its own, like like drones can, and fire missiles at ground targets like drones can. And if you set it up like that, then I could see it being kind of expensive. Alternatively, if you set it up like a conventional aircraft where it can only fire missiles at ground targets if you're conducting a strafing run or if the ground target has been lased, it would actually be pretty darn cheap. At least that's the two ways I can see it set it. That's the two ways I can see it set up. And for Russia, if you want to, I suppose you could add the Uran 9, because if we're going to talk about things like UGVs, which granted the Ripsaw isn't just a UGV, I think there's a manned version as well. But if you want to talk about things like UGVs, and as an aside, I've seen a lot of people asking about things like drones, either loitering munitions, a la the IAI Harpy or the Lancet, or small drones like FPVs or bomber drones, like Ukraine has made famous, or the war in Ukraine has made famous. I don't really see those in game. I don't see how they would work. Either you'd have to make an entirely new category of aircraft and put them in, and then modify a vast majority of the units in game so that they could be engaged by things like RWSs, and that's aside making them new units, or making infantry units that can launch drones at vehicles, but vehicles with RWSs might be able to shoot the drones down or things like that. It would be complicated, it would be convoluted, and it would not add anything of meaningful substance to the game. At least the small quadcopters or FPV drones. Loitering munitions might be a little bit different. If you want to treat them like cheap cruise missiles that you can designate an area for the drone to fly to and then loiter around for a bit, and then either slam into something that they see or crash or go home if they don't. That could be interesting, but I'm not sure how useful it would be. You see, one thing that the developers said, and this is the reason, this is the reason why we don't have things like trenches or mines in the game, is that they want to make gameplay flow. They don't want the gameplay to get stagnant. They don't want things to be overly defensive. So I don't see them doing things like adding drones. Or again, things like mines or trenches. Those slow gameplay down. Those make gameplay stagnant. And honestly, I'd say that it's hard enough to attack now with how prevalent ATGMs are, and they're just as prevalent in game as they are in the real world. So there's nothing unrealistic there. But if you add things like loitering munitions, that's just going to encourage people to be even more defensive, to try and hide behind a bunch of man pads or other SHORAD systems. So I don't really see how you can incorporate it. I mean, it'd certainly be interesting, and I'd be open to the idea, but I don't see how it's going to work. I started talking about the Ural 9, and then I got distracted by drones. One thing that that you could suggest about the Ural, I say Ural, the Uran, it's like URAN, I think. The Uran 9. I don't know. The UGV thing that Russia tested out in Syria and found out that it sucked, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. That is kind of the whole point of testing, after all. One idea behind it is to use it like a sort of mobile pillbox. It's pretty heavily armored. It's pretty heavily armed. You've got a 30mm autocannon. You've got a coaxial 7.62. And I think you've got like Cornets. You basically have the BMP-2 turret. Where is it? You basically have the BMP-2 Berserk turret, maybe without the AGS. I don't know if the Euron 9 can be equipped with that. The thing can also be equipped with 6 or 12 RPO-A thermobaric rockets, the same kind that some Russian infantry have, and even man-pads like Igla or Strela. But the platform wasn't stabilized, and it was kind of slow from my understanding. So the idea is use it almost like a mobile pillbox. You drive it to a point, you drop it off, and then you use it almost like a tower in a tower defense game. That might be I think that might be interesting. Maybe with the ability to fire the PKT on the move, but nothing else. I honestly don't know what other drones that you could put in the game, or at least that would be reasonable and would fit in the game. As for Russia, honestly, I can't think of much off the top of my head to add for Russia. Although I will say this, I have made comments earlier in the past saying things like adding because I believe one of the versions of the M1117, and I suppose you could add this to Airborne, was a slightly enlarged version without a turret that acted like a APC that could carry 8 or 9 guys. And the idea behind it was that it could carry 8 or 9 guys as a sort of light wheeled IFV, or not IFV, a light wheeled APC. And I thought that was maybe something that you could add to the airborne infantry to have a armored infantry transport that you could throw out the back of a plane. I will concede this point. I misunderstood what you were supposed to use the airborne infantry specialization for. I was trying to compare it on a one-to-one basis with the VDV brigade. And I was looking at the armored vehicles that the VDV brigade had and figured that you need something like that with the airborne infantry. This is wrong. The VDV brigade and the airborne infantry, even though they are both designed to be thrown out the back of a plane, they do different things from my understanding. The VDV is basically designed to have some kind of staying power, which is why they have armored vehicles. The armored vehicles aren't exactly mobile, but they have some kind of staying power. Airborne infantry is basically the exact opposite. They don't have much staying power, but they are very, very mobile. And so the way you're supposed to use them is that you're supposed to use them basically to stay on the move and not commit to a fight unless it's one on your terms. That's what you're supposed to use airborne infantry for versus the VDV. So I will make that statement. Also, on the subject of airborne infantry, if you want something that can airdrop stuff that's bigger than a C-17, why not add the C-5? Can you airdrop things out of a... I don't know if you can airdrop things out of a C-5. I know the front of the C-5 opens up, but does the back? At the same time, if you want something you can airdrop, or something for the VDV brigade that's larger than the IL-76, what about the AN-124? Actually, now I'm genuinely interested if the AN-124 can has a rear ramp. I think it does, and I think the C-5 does. Although if they add a Ukrainian, or if they add Ukraine as a nation, I would be genuinely disappointed if we don't get the AN-225 for the Ukrainian airborne. If they even have airborne. I know they have air assault brigades, not airborne, but last time I checked, their air assault brigades were running around with T-80s, so... And that's not exactly the kind of thing you could throw out the back of a plane. Well, I mean, it is. You could throw it out the back of a plane, it just... I make no bets on it being in functional condition after it hits the ground. Anyway, I don't really... The problem I have with Russia is that there are some things I could potentially suggest about adding to various Russian specializations, but at the same time, I want to kind of hang on to them and for filling out a new specialization. And the reason why I say this is because a lot of the things that I tried to talk about for the other specializations fit within the specialization. So, like when I was talking about the AMPV Amshorad, or the AMPV with the mortar, that fit within the Armor Brigade specialization because that's the one that uses the AMPV. Or when I was talking about maybe making a slam ram based off of a Humvee chassis, that fits with the Airborne Infantry because they use the Humvee. And what I wanted to do was I wanted the stuff that I suggest for a specialization to fit within that specialization. The problem is that I can't really think of anything off the top of my head, and after doing a moderate amount of research, that I can add for the Russian specializations that fits with the specialization that can't, or that would fit with the specialization more than potentially be used to fill out a new specialization. I have some ideas, but I'm not sure if I should suggest them now or in a new specialization. Like I could suggest the Panzer is it the Panzer S1? The 8x8 truck version of the Panzer. I could suggest putting that in the motorized infantry specialization. But that could also go into a new specialization. Although it would fit pretty well with the motorized infantry. Another thing I could do was suggest aircraft like the MiG-31, but I kind of want to save that for talking about a new specialization. For example, when it came to the Striker Cav specialization, one thing I could mention was things like the M107 or the M110, but I want to save those for when I talk about a new U.S. specialization. I actually have two ideas for U.S. specialization, or for new U.S. specialization. That's why I'm not talking about Russia very much. Honestly, my biggest suggestion for Russia would be things like engineering vehicles. Alternatively, I suppose you could take one of the Typhoon the Typhoon MRAPs and mount an ATGM system to it, kind of like what you do with the Sarmat 2. But how is that any different from the BTRD robot or the Cornet D1? The BTRRD, that is, or the Cornet D1. It isn't really. I mean, I think Russia wants to make a new version of the Sprut, or something like something to replace the Sprut, but I don't know any details about that. Alternatively, there is things like the BMD-3, which is basically just a modified BMD-2, but A, how is that different from the regular BMD-2? And B, could that be used as a airdroppable light vehicle in a new specialization? Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised to see the BMD-3 added to the VDV if it's different from the BMD-2 somehow, and I'm not sure that it is. The only other thing I could think to mention, and I know I've mentioned this before, is unifying the squad size of the non-VDV infantry and unifying the number of seats that a majority of the Russian transport vehicles have. Preferably unifying the squad size to 8 and raising the seating capacity of the vehicles accordingly. Honestly, though, it really doesn't help that I'm just not all that familiar with the kind of equipment that Russia has, or, well, probably not Russia, but like the Soviet Union towards the end of the Cold War could have produced. I know there's some interesting stuff out there, but I don't know if it got far enough in its development process to qualify, for lack of a better word, to be put in the game. You've got things like, for example, the T-95, the Black Eagle for Russian MBTs. Did either of those actually reach a prototype stage, though? And if they did, how effective would they be, and how would they compare to something like, for example, the T-14? They may very well be downgrades. If I'm going to be honest, I'm a little bit sad that one of the Russian specializations wasn't a special projects specialization, kind of like a counterpart to SOCOM, because you could do things like the Uran 9. The Ural 9 or Uren. The Russian UGV that I suggested using like a mobile pillbox. I have no idea how to pronounce that. That thing. Or maybe the SU-75 as I mentioned earlier, although that is in the mock-up or that hasn't reached the prototype stage. Or things like the stealthy KH-52. And I mean, heck, if you really want to dig into it, you've got things like the MI-30. Is it 36 or 38? The MI-40 and the MI-42, which were described as airborne IFVs. But they were supposed to be helicopters, but very heavily armed and very heavily armored. Imagine something like an MI-24, but with more armor and even more guns. Although none of those reached the prototype stage, to my knowledge. One suggestion that I can think of while we're here is the Tu-22. Specifically, the Tu-22 is the KH-32. I might have already mentioned this before, or I might have just mentioned it to myself. The KH-32 is a version of the KH-22. Now, the difference between the KH-32 and the KH-22 is that the KH-32 had the warhead size reduced to only 500 kilograms, or 1,102 pounds of high explosive. But the range was doubled. So compared to the KH-32, the KH-22 might have a much bigger boom on the other end, maybe double that of the KH-32. Although I'd like to point out, doubling the amount of explosives does not double the blast radius. I can't think of any bomb in game that has one metric ton of explosives. The Fab 3000 that would have theoretically 1.5 metric tons, because the payload of a bomb is usually only about half the weight of the bomb. The other half of the weight would be things like fusing, the fin configuration, but a vast majority of it's just the metal case. If you look at a 2,000-pound bomb, that doesn't mean that the explosives, that it has 2,000 pounds of explosives in it. That just means that it has that the total bomb weight is about 2,000 pounds. The 2,000-pound Mark 84, the weight of that fluctuates between, I think, like 2,045 to 1,960, depending on the fusing and the fin configuration. Oh, all this talking is murdering my throat. But an FAB 3000, 3 metric tons. The internals, in theory, are 1.5 metric tons, so that's the closest I got. So what you might be looking with a 1 metric ton payload on the Tu-22, or on the KH-22, might be only a 5,000 meter range, but a much larger blast radius, and much more damage. So it's more of like a higher risk, higher reward loadout. Aside from that, I can't really think of much else to suggest. Oh well. So I guess I'm going to end it there then.